So good afternoon. Thank you so much. All right. So I'm going to talk today about different ways of thinking about information flow. I'm going to start by saying, in his seminal pop book, Csikszentmihalyi argued that people are happiest when they can reach a state of flow. He talks about performers and athletes who are in the height of their profession, the experience they feel as time passes by and everything just clicks. Right? People feel as though they have attention. Everything is about attention. They're simultaneously in focus and not in focus. The world is aligned and it just makes sense. So consider what it means to be in flow in an information landscape defined by networked media, and you will see where Web 2.0 is taking us. The goal is not to be a passive consumer of information or to simply tune in, but to simply tune in when the time is right. To be in a world where information is everywhere. To be peripherally aware of information as it flows by, grabbing it at the right moment or when it is most relevant, entertaining, valuable, informative. Most of the information that is in this social landscape, right? It's about social. It's about people interacting with each other. But there's also information that's about entertainment or about news. And being in flow with information is different than Csikszentmihalyi's sense. It's not about the perfect attention, but it's about a sense of alignment, of being aligned with information. Now, as of late, we've been talking a lot about content streams of information. This metaphor is extremely powerful. The idea is that you're living inside the stream, adding to it, consuming it, redirecting it. The stream metaphor is about reaching flow, but it's also about restructuring the ways in which information flows in modern society. Those who are most enamored with services like Twitter talk passionately about feeling as though they are living and breathing with the world around them. Peripherally aware and in tune, adding content to the stream and grabbing it when it's appropriate. Of course, this state is extremely delicate, plagued by information overload and weighed down by frustrating tools. Now, for the longest of time, we focused on sites of information as a destination, of accessing information as a process, of producing information as a task. But what happens when all of this changes? While things are certainly clunky at best, this is all the promised land of the technologies we're creating. This is happening because of how information society is changing. Before we talk more about flow, I want to sort of step back and think about shifts in media landscape, shifts that all of you are a part of, and the way in which it changes things. For the last couple of centuries, we've been living in an era of broadcast media, but we've been switching to an era of networked media. This fundamentally alters the structure and ways in which information flows. Those who believe in broadcast structures recognize the efficiency of a single centralized source. Of course, there's a little nostalgia here, right? The image is clear, the 1950s nightly news. Everyone tunes in to receive the same message at the same time. There are newspapers, the radio stations, the magazines, all of them telling the same newsy story. Of course, centralized sources of information are powerful because they control the means of distribution. There's also, at the same time, the town gossip, the church, the pub. These too were centralized channels for disseminating information. But the thing about broadcast structures is they take one critical thing for granted. They assume attention. There's an assumption that everyone will tune in and give their attention to the broadcast entity, even though that was never actually true in the first place. As TV channels and publishing brands proliferated, we've seen that attention can be easily fragmented. And over the last few decades, increasing numbers of entities have been fighting for a smaller and smaller portion of the pie. Even gossip rags have started competing for attention. The opportunities for media creation have been rising for decades, but the internet provided new mechanisms by which people could actually put their own content out there. From blogging to social network sites to media sharing sites to sites that provide social streams, we are seeing countless ways in which motivated individuals can make their personal content available. Now, there were always folks willing to share their story, but what the internet did was give a pulpit on which they could stand. Internet technologies fundamentally dismantle and rework the structures of distribution. Distribution is a process by which content creators find channels which they can disseminate their creation. In effect, they're pushing out content. Sure, people have to be there to receive it, but the idea is there are limited channels for distribution, and thus getting access to the limited resource is very hard. But this, as we know, is no longer the case. As network technologies proliferate around the world, we can assume that everyone has a channel of distribution available to them and between them. In theory, anyone could contact anyone else and get content to them. With the barriers to distribution collapsing, what matters is not the actual act of distribution, but the act of consumption. Thus, the power is no longer in the hands of those who control the channels of distribution, but those who control the limited resources of attention. This is precisely why you were the person of the year. Attention is valuable and precious, and people want you and your attention. It is no longer about push, it is now about pull, and the law of 2 feet is now culturally pervasive. Now, while we're dismantling traditional structures of distribution, we're also building new forms of information dissemination. Content is no longer being hawked, but links are. People throughout the network are using the attention they receive to traffic and pointers to other content, serving as content mediators. Numerous people have become expert information networkers. Of course, to all of you in this room, this feels like old news, right? Isn't this the whole thing of Web 2.0? Isn't this what we've been living? Of course, right? But now that we're seeing Web 2.0 go mainstream, we're seeing all sorts of folks get into the game. We're seeing different kinds of practices evolve that don't look like what the early adopters did. And the business folks are all sitting there walking around this space trying desperately to turn it into a broadcast channel. Of course, by and large, they're failing. But we need to talk about these shifts so we can talk about the innovations that need to happen. If folks are going to get in flow with information, we need to understand how information flows differently. But I want to highlight what some of the core challenges are, the things that we take for granted where technological hopes and reality collide. Right? And I want to get into this because in order to get innovation in the space, we actually have to address some of these key issues that we've been living with for a long time. The first of this has to do with democratization. Switching from a model of distribution to a model of attention is inherently disruptive, but it is not inherently democratizing. This is a mistake we often make when talking about this shift. We may be democratizing certain types of access, but we're not democratizing attention. Just because we're moving to a state where anyone has the ability to get information into the stream does not mean that attention will be divided equally. Opening up the structures to distribution is not democratizing when distribution is no longer the organizing function of this space. Now, some in the room might immediately think, but it's about meritocracy. People will give their attention to what is best. This too is mistaken logic. What people give their attention to depends on a whole set of factors that have nothing to do with what's best. At the most simplistic level, consider the role of language. People will pay attention to content that is in their language, even if they can access content in any other language. Right? This means that in a very short period of time, Chinese language content will get more attention than English content, let alone Dutch content or Hebrew content or content in any other language. Connected to this, we actually have to think about stimulation. People consume content that stimulates their mind and senses, that which angers, excites, energizes, entertains, or otherwise creates an emotional response. This is not always the best or most informative content, but that which triggers a reaction. This isn't inherently a good thing. Consider the food equivalent. Our bodies are programmed to consume fat and sugars because they're rare in nature. Thus, when they come around, we should grab them and eat them. In the same way, we're biologically programmed to be attentive to things that stimulate. Content that is gross, violent, or sexual, gossip, which is humiliating, embarrassing, or offensive. This is what stimulates people inherently. If we're not careful, we're going to develop the psychological equivalent of obesity. We'll find ourselves consuming content that is least beneficial for ourselves and society as a whole. Now, we're addicted to gossip for a reason. We want to know what's happening because information brings us closer to people. When we know something about someone, there's a sense of connection. But the information ecology we live in today has twisted this whole thing upside down. Just because I can follow the details of Angelina Jolie's life doesn't mean she knows that I exist. Now, this is what scholars talk a lot about as parasocial relations. But with Facebook, what you can do is you can turn your closest friends into celebrities, characters you gawk at and obsess with, without actually gaining the benefits of social intimacy and bonding. Stimulation creates cognitive connections, but it is possible for there to be too much stimulation. We don't want a disconnected, numb society or a society of unequal social connections. So driving towards greater and more intense stimulation may not be what we want. Of course, there's money here, and people will try to manipulate this dynamic for their own purpose. There are folks who put out highly stimulating content or spread gossip to get attention, and in an attention economy, that works. Right? And they succeed. They create a pretty unhealthy cycle. So we have to start asking ourselves what balance looks like and how we can move towards an environment where there's incentives for individuals to consume healthy information content, where we create content that benefits society as a whole, or, at the very least, how not to feed the trolls. Now, the third key issue is homophily. In a networked world, people connect to people like themselves. What flows across the network flows through edges of similarity. The ability to connect to others like us allows us to flow information across space and time in impressively new ways. But there's also a downside. Prejudice, intolerance, bigotry, and power are all baked into our networks. In a world of networked media, it's easy not to get access to views from people who think differently and have a different perspective. Information can and does flow in ways that creates and reinforces social divides. Democratic philosophy depends on shared information structures, but the combination of self-segmentation and networked information flow means that we lose the common rhetorical ground through which we can converse. Now, throughout my studies of social media, I've been astonished by the people who think that XYZ, whatever site, is for people like them. I interviewed gay men who thought Friendster was a gay dating site because all they saw was other gay men. I interviewed teens who believed that everyone on MySpace was Christian because all they saw were profiles that contained biblical quotes. We all live in our own worlds with people who share our values, and with networked media, it's often hard to see beyond that, especially if we don't want to. Now, ironically, the one place where I'm finding people are being forced to think outside of their box is the trending topics on Twitter. Consider a topic that trended a few weeks ago, things darkies say. Started in South Africa, the topic is fundamentally about language and cultural diversity, but when read in a US race context, it reads fundamentally as racist. Boy, did this blow up, right? Forcing a whole lot of folks to think about language and cultural differences. Why? Because trending topics bring a topic that gained traction in a segment of the network to the whole broader community for broader awareness. Of course, it's actually hard to get a meaningful dialogue going, even if trending topics trigger reactions. So in an era of networked media, we need to recognize that networks are homophilous and operate accordingly. Technology does not inherently disintegrate social division. In fact, more often than not, it reinforces them. Only a small percentage of people that are inclined to seek out opinions and ideas from cultures other than their own are likely to do so. These people are and should be highly valued in society. But, part of the challenge is that just because people have the ability to be what Ethan Zuckerman talks about as xenophiles, does not mean that they will. Fourth key thing to think about, power. When we think about centralized sources of information distribution, it's easy to understand that power is at stake. But network structures of consumption are also configured by power, and we cannot forget that or assume that access alone is power. Power is about being able to command attention, influence others' attention, and otherwise traffic in information. We give power to people when we give them our attention, and people gain power when they bridge different worlds and determine what information can and will flow across the network. In a networked culture, there is also power in being the person spreading the content. When my colleagues and I were examining retweets in Twitter, we saw something fascinating, a tension between citationality and attribution. In short, should you give credit to the author of the content or acknowledge the person who showed you the information? Instinctually, many of us might believe that the author is the most important person to credit. But at the same time, few ideas are really the product of just one individual. So why not credit the messenger in helping the content flow? What we saw on Twitter was that for many people, crediting who they heard it from was more important. And we found that reasonable people disagreed on which was more important, author or the person you heard it from. Now, in a broadcast model, those who control the distribution channels often profit more than the creators. Right? Think Clear Channel, record labels, TV producers, etc. Unfortunately, there's an assumption that if we get rid of the limitations to distribution, the power will revert to the creators. This is not what's happening. Distribution today is making people aware that they can come and get something, but those who get access to people's attention are a very few and small privileged population. So instead, what we're seeing is a new kind of information broker emerging. These folks get credit for their structural position. While the monetary benefits may be indirect right now, countless consulting gigs have arisen for folks based on their power as information brokers. The old controllers of information are losing their stature and not particularly happy about it. But what's emerging is not inherently the power of the creators, as often hoped for by folks in this room. Instead, it's the power of the modern-day information broker. So in order to make this work, we have to think about how our information ecology evolves. And we will see some radical changes taking place. First, I believe that information spaces will get more and more niche. We will see this in places where people direct their attention, but we will also see it in terms of the success of enterprises. That's the challenge here. Successful businesses will not be everything to everyone. That's the broadcast mentality, and we're seeing that shift radically right now. Instead, it's about playing a meaningful role to a cohort of committed consumers who will give you your attention because of the relevance. Now, to be relevant today requires understanding context, popularity, and reputation. In a broadcast era, we can assume that the disseminator organized information because they were the destination. In a networked era, there won't be destinations, but rather a network of content and people constantly moving, constantly changing. Topic won't be a given. And we're already seeing this in streams-based media, right? As we're seeing people collide social gossip alongside productive content, news alongside status updates. Right now, it's one big mess. But the key is not going to be to create distinct destinations organized around topics, but to find ways in which content can be surfaced in context, regardless of where it resides. Making content work in a networked era is going to be about living in the stream, consuming and producing alongside your customers. Consuming to understand, producing to be relevant, and content creators are not going to be able to dictate the cultural norms just because they can make their content available. We'll still see accountability for those who are trafficking the content. Now, we need technological innovations from you in the room. For example, tools that allow people to more easily contextualize relevant content regardless of where they are and what they are doing. Tools that allow people to slice and dice content so as to not reach information overload. This is not simply about aggregating or curating content to create personalized destination sites. Frankly, I don't think that this will work for many people. Instead, the tools that consumers need are those that allow them to get into the flow, that allow them to live inside the information structures wherever they are, whatever they're doing. The tools that allow them to easily grab what they need and stay peripherally aware without feeling overwhelmed. Of course, we also need to rethink our business plans. I doubt this cultural shift will be paid for in better advertising models. Advertising is based on capturing attention, typically by interrupting the broadcast message or being inserted into the content itself. Trying to reach information flow is not about being interrupted. Advertising does work when it's part of the flow itself, right? Ads are great when they appear as a desirable answer to a search query, or when they appear at the moment of a purchase. But when information is being shared as social in nature, advertising is fundamentally a disruption. Figuring out how to monetize sociality is also a problem, and not one new to the internet. Think about how we monetize sociality in physical spaces. Typically, it involves second-order consumption of calories, right? Venues provide a space for social interaction to occur, and we expect people to consume as a way to pay rent. Restaurants, bars, cafes, these all survive on this model. But we have yet to find the digital equivalent of alcohol for the internet. As we continue to move from a broadcast media of information to a networked one, we will continue to see reworkings of the information landscape. Some of what is unfolding is exciting. Some of it is absolutely terrifying. The key is to get away from our utopian ideas and also at the same time our dystopian ones, and recognizing what changes and what stays the same. The future of Web 2.0 is about information flow, and if you want to help people, you have to help them reach that state of flow, that state of comfort where they know that they're actually making sense of the world around them. Many of you in the room are setting the tone for this, right? You're creating the technologies that allow people to get into flow. You're creating the technologies that allow them to make sense of the world. And it's really exciting and it's really rejuvenating. But at the same time, you also have a tremendous amount of power of setting what's going on. And I encourage you to step away from the utopian rhetorics and the dystopian ones, to find a way of actually engaging with people that make sense in the lives that they're leading, and to give them a sense of feeling that they can be part of this information landscape, wherever they are, whatever they're doing. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.